Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. The webinar is being brought to you by the Planning, Monitoring and Control Specific Interest Group. My name is Miller, and I'm part of the committee for this specific interest group. And I'm really pleased that we have one of our other committee members here with us today to give us this presentation. Right, so without very much ado, we've got a really exciting webinar today, which forms part of 3 presentations developed by Scott and Martin. I'll shortly move along to them to introduce themselves and to explain the reason for the webinar. From my perspective, this is an incredibly useful presentation because it starts to look up earned value as a management system and not just a simple tool or a couple of sort of equations that are just easily applied. So please stick with it and do feedback on this webinar and come back for the other 2, as this will start to unpick some of the myths and understandings around earned value management. So we'll first move on to Scott to introduce himself.
Hello, Miller, and thank you very much. And a big welcome to everyone. We're honoured, Martin and I, that you could spend some time with us today. I'll go through a couple of slides before Martin and I introduce ourselves. And I just want to reiterate what Miller's just said there. What we're trying to achieve is to help you build a basic knowledge of earned value management as a system of work and not just mathematics. We'll also spend a bit of time comparing earned value management systems with what you might regard as a more traditional project control system. So if I move on a slide. So what are we doing today? We're going to introduce you the concept of earned value management as a system, as I said before, and we're going to dispel you of a few myths that earned value is simply mathematics. So introducing myself, my name is Scott Butcher. I've been working in defence for about 30 years, both as an engineer and as a project manager and as a project controller. So I've seen life from a lot of different angles. I've been in project controls quite specifically for the last 18 years roundabout, although about 6 weeks ago I changed jobs and I'm now a project manager again. My first experience of earned value was in about 2003. And since then I've used it extensively, and I'm now an experienced integrated baseline review participant and chair. Martin, over to you to introduce yourself.
Good morning, everybody. Scott said, my name is Martin Eveleigh. My background is in mechanical and electrical engineering, but I moved into program management in 1993. I've served 40 plus years in the defence sector, both in the UK and the USA. I am the author of a Rolls-Royce US Department of Defense validated earned value management system description in my previous role, and my background has led me into leading teams in project controls, earned value management, and also in its assurance processes, including IBRs. So in the field of IBRs, which we'll talk to in the 3rd webinar, enabling and leading those types of processes and others that are akin to it.
Thank you, Martin. I just want to say as well, is given my background, unfortunately I can't bring you real world examples to demonstrate some of our learning here today. So apologies for that, but what Martin and I are both happy to do is talk to people outside of the webinar if you want to expand on some of what you've heard today. So why these webinars? So, about 2 years ago, it would have been now, in the SIG, we were looking for possibilities of what we would like to talk to people about in webinars. And I mentioned the fact that I was frustrated with the obsession with metrics, with in particular something called SPI and CPI in EV. I did a poll of the SIG, and it was widely agreed that people understood the mathematics of earned value management, but very few people understood the system that underpins the data. You cannot do the mathematics, you cannot do the analysis unless you have credible data. And what Martin and I want to talk to you about over these 3 webinars is how to get that data so it's credible. Moving on, the content then. So we're going to start today with some very basic stuff. And what we're going to do for you as well is bust a few myths. So what we're going to talk about is this incessant false focus on some very specific analysis. We're going to talk to you about the basic building blocks of an earned value management system. And we're going to talk to you as well about why it's so important in earned value management to have a valid and credible performance measurement baseline. In the next 2 webinars, we're going to expand on that. So on webinar 2, we'll start to talk to you in more detail about what constitutes an effective earned value management system. And then we will also talk to you about tailoring of that system, because if you look at the actual earned value guidelines, there's 32 of them. Meeting that is incredibly tough and is likely to be expensive, so you need to do it in an applicable way. The last webinar we'll do is all about proving that you've got a decent earned value management system and proving that it will add value to your project. So that's the introduction. Let's start by busting a few myths, shall we? Now, I do apologize for this slide. I could not find a PowerPoint icon for an iceberg. So in perhaps rather poor taste, I've given you a cruise liner instead. Although I would admit that perhaps with our project experience, we may think this is rather apt, that the cruise liner is sailing serenely on and about to crash into the iceberg, despite the fact that what it can see in front of itself. And this is another analogy with perhaps with earned value management, is the fact that earned value management enables us to look well ahead. It's like the sailor sitting in the crow's nest, peering into the distance, making sure he can see the future. So let's move on. Many of you, if not all of you on this call today, will have heard of cost performance index and schedule performance index. Now, when Martin and I put these webinars together, we promised we would teach no maths. That was the point of these webinars. You can find about the maths of earned value in many, many places, but it's important I let you know a little bit about what these two indices are, just in case you haven't experienced them before. So let's start with CPI. CPI is the ratio of work I've achieved to the cost of the work or cost of achieving it. So it's an efficiency index. How much did it cost me to do what I said I was going to do? And because it's a ratio, if it's less than 1, it's generally bad. And if it's greater than equal to 1, it's generally good. i.e., if it's generally equal to 1, I've achieved more per pound than I thought I was going to. SPI is the equivalent ratio for schedule. So it's the ratio of work I've achieved, let's call it earned value, to the work that I said I would have achieved by this time, let's call it planned value. And like CPI, a ratio of less than 1 is bad, it means I'm behind schedule, and a ratio of greater than or equal to 1 is good, because it means I'm ahead of schedule. That was an incredibly quick skip through those indices, and I've deliberately really simplified it. And I've done that for a reason, because despite the fact that I've oversimplified this, saying less than 1 is bad, greater than 1 is good, this is about as much as many people know about AV, and yet they are still willing to make decisions on big projects based around these two indices alone. So let's look at what's below the surface of our iceberg. And we'll start with schedule variance and cost variance. So if you remember, I said SPI and CPI were ratios. Schedule variance and cost variance are absolutes. So cost variance, let me start with that one, is the difference between what I've earned and what it's cost me. So it starts to get, I've earned £10,000, it cost me £15,000 to deliver that work, therefore I have a variance of minus £5,000 in that instance. It starts to get absolute. And the reason why this is important is if I'm doing a piece of work that costs £10,000 and I've got a CPI of 0.9, that looks in the metrics exactly the same as a ratio of 0.9 for a £10 million piece of work. So it doesn't actually tell me perhaps where I need to point my attention as a manager. So EV specialists prefer to use SV and CV rather than SPI and CPI. Yet, as I say before, in management circles, there is often an obsession with SPI and CPI. These metrics I've shown you here are good. They do tell me something about my project, and I can use them to make management decisions. However, these particular metrics, generally speaking, are backward looking. One of the great powers of earned value, and I mentioned this with my analogy with the sailor in the crow's nest looking forwards, is EV has this fantastic ability to look forwards, not to predict the future per se, but to give you an indication that if you go along with the rate you're going or the efficiency you're using, your project will take this long, it will cost this much. It's also got some fabulous abilities to say, if you want to correct your project, you will need to improve your performance by this much as well. And it's also got some ways of independently challenging those numbers. So you can actually sit there and bracket what my outturn might be and find out roughly where I'm going to outturn and then make management decisions to bring myself back on track. So you can see it's not just about SPI and CPI and SV and CV, because they're backward looking metrics. I can start to look forwards now and start to make management decisions about my forward look. But there's more. So what we start to bring in now is the earned value management system. So an earned value management system, I mentioned very briefly before, has 32 criteria attached to it. And this starts to bring in those that are structured around organization, planning and budgeting, accounting, revisions, analysis. And you can see I've introduced there a whole wealth of further acronyms about what an earned value management system it means. And finally on this slide, what we're telling you here is to get good data, to get credible information that I can analyze and make valid management decisions on, I need to set up and continuously operate an effective earned value management system. And that enables me then, as I say before, to collect and interpret the data and use it effectively. Of course, with all of this sort of stuff, earned value management is a system. It provides me the data. It still requires the captain of my cruise liner to listen to the sailor in the crow's nest and make course corrections as required. So myth one, I think hopefully, even in the first few minutes of this webinar, we've already come to the conclusion that it's not just about calculating CPI and SPI. So I think personally that myth is busted. So having given you a very basic outline there of what I'm interested in this and why I wanted to do these webinars, I'm going to hand over to Martin, who's going to talk a little bit about EV systems and how they dock in with project control systems. Martin, over to you.
Okay. Perhaps the biggest myth of all is that, and I've heard this said in many circles, that project controls and earned value management are different. In reality, they aren't. They very much complement each other at the best, with earned value going an extra length, if you like, if you have to go down that path. So before we can even think of implementing, or perhaps advising confidently that we already have implemented an earned value management system, we must recognize exactly what this means. There's confusion, sometimes even you could call it neglect, exists around the necessary underlying processes that need to be enabled and complied with. That's even before we can calculate those metrics that Scott has alluded to in the previous slides, let alone attempt to enact decisions upon them. So there are a number of truths that we have to recognize right off the bat. Truth number one is that whether we are contractually required to implement an earned value management system, or maybe we are being pushed by management to aspire to it, or perhaps we simply should or want to enable a project control system, the underlying processes for all of those things are identical. We'll look at a bit further at that statement in the next slide, but before that, let's go on to two more truths. Truth number two is that irrespective of an earned value management system or a project control system, the fundamental aim will be to attain agreement on an integrated schedule and an associated performance measurement baseline, and to take into account unmitigated risks. Those three things are paramount. All of those things allow performance to be reported, and then you can go one step further to make informed decisions and enact upon them. Truth number three, there's only ever one current baseline. Although multiple versions can be compared, very often you may find customers require information to be reported against a previous baseline as well as the current. That would depend on your particular contract and the needs of your customer. However, there is only ever one current baseline, and it comprises knowledge and acceptance of schedule, cost, resources, and risk. If we omit or steer away from any of these truths, then the baseline will be out of step with reality. And even those false focus metrics that Scott has alluded to, they will become irrelevant. You won't be able to look at where you are, let alone where you're heading, and have any confidence behind those statements. In both the EVMS and the project control system, it's people, process, data, and tools. Those four things are paramount. and we'll see a little bit more about that later. The takeaway from this slide, therefore, is that you can implement a project control system and you can include EVA metrics. And this is without the need of going to the full bells and whistles of developing, deploying, and maintaining a full-up compliant earned value management system. The next slide will examine this statement a bit further. So before I dive into the diagram, a couple of things to reiterate. I mentioned truth one, previous slide, that the underlying processes are the same for both the PCS and EVMS, those being people, process, data, and tools. And you can see those clearly on the left-hand side of the diagram. The major difference is that an earned value management system will have contractually 32 explicit and rigorous rules of engagement. For those of you who have come across these things before, it's the EIA 748, 32 guidelines of earned value. Previously it was ANSI, American National Standards Institute, and that is supported by the NDIA PASEG, which is the Planning and Scheduling Excellence Guide, and GASP, which is the Generally Accepted Scheduling Principles. Those three things come together within the 32 rules of earned value, and they have to be explicitly followed day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out. So my warning to everybody on this call is that if you are not contracted to EIA 748 or even a earned value management system, be careful of what you wish for. There will be significant training, there will be significant assurance that will be required to go along with it, and you can gain pretty much the same kind of outcomes with a really robust and assured project control system. Going to the diagram, you'll see, looking left or right, there's a linear flow from the project control system to earned value management and then onto earned value analysis. The devil is always going to be in the detail. A project control system can achieve similar outcomes, as I said, to an EVMS, yet it will alleviate the need for unwarranted bureaucracy and costs. If not contracted to an EVMS, then you will need to decide what your project program requires. There will be some peer pressure, perhaps. There will be some likes from people within the project, but it's best to take a balanced view before you opt for one or the other. In the case of both the EVMS and the project control system, then a system description is warranted. It should be produced, regularly reviewed, and updated. There has to be specific role players with responsibilities and accountabilities. These will need to be trained, and we'll talk around that in a little bit. Next slide. Substantiation of a baseline and unmitigated risks is an absolute. Those things are needed right off the bat. Importantly, there has to be baseline change control, and that doesn't mean that you have a way of recording changes simply. There has to be some rules behind those changes, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable as a baseline change. EVA can be initiated on both, which I've alluded to already. Compliance to process must be assured. That is a topic for webinar 3. If you look at the diagram, then you can see in the top left there's a yellow arrow, models, guides, and advice. All of those things go into how a project control system is written and is produced in a system description. That system description will talk around organization, planning, resourcing, budget, and change control right through to insurance. If you go one step further and an earned value management system, you can see those self-same topics being portrayed again. The only difference is that now you will have an earned value management system description, and that will show how you intend to comply with the 32 rules of earned value, as well as the PASEG and the GASP. In both cases, earned value analysis can be forthcoming because it's just a simple set of metrics and the mathematics, which Scott said we're not going to teach here, are really very basic. In the world of earned value, it is the EIA 748 guidelines and the rules that you have to follow, which is really going to cause you heartburn if you go down that route. So it's all in the rules. There are some similarities, there are some differences. Common processes. Scott's already alluded that organization, planning, budgeting, accounting, revisions, and reporting, all those are fundamental aspects of whether you have a project control system or an earned value management system description. Role players, as I said, will be required. Now, as a minimum, project and program managers, master scheduler, control account manager, and of course the PMO are the basics that you need. But additionally, it's good practice to include resource managers, analysts, and if your work breakdown structure dictates by depth and breadth, then intermediate project or program managers also. Each of these will have accountabilities and responsibilities, and it will show their interactions as you follow their processes. Data sets. Well, we've probably all lived in a world where leaders have asked for different types of data sets, and that could even be color of fonts, things that they particularly want to look at, things that are in vogue at the moment. But the key thing with an earned value management system and the project management system should be that they should be minimal, they should be focused, they should be standardized, and above all, they should be owned and change controlled. Best practice will operate via management by exception, whereas these data sets are not reviewed across the entire spectrum of the WBS, but they are done so where thresholds have been breached. And typically things like schedule, cost, risk, resource, estimate to complete, and estimate at complete are really the backbone of that data set that you should be looking at, but of course there will be many more. Training should cover obviously initial for your novices, but also for refresher, even for your experts. This will form your license to operate. Special mention on tools. They can be purchased off the shelf or they can be in-house produced. The thing that I will warn is that tools are not the utopian answer. Tools will only offer help. They will not cure any underlying problems of things like non-compliance to the basic processes that we've alluded to. It's rather knowledge and compliance working together. Lastly on this slide, as stated previously, the devil's always going to be in the detail. A project control system, earned value management system relies on those standards. Again, people, process, data, tools. And EVMS goes much further. It has definite benefits to a larger, more complex projects or programs, but has added rigors also. And again, we're back to the needs of EIA 748, those 32 rules that we keep mentioning, and also compliance to the Planning and Scheduling Excellence Guide, and also the generally accepted scheduling principles. Those things are the backbone of these systems. Both, however, are reliant on maintaining the level of continual operational assurance. So, myth number 2 is that project controls and earned value management are different. Well, the takeaway, hopefully, is that you will have recognized that there are strong synergies between the two. And that they both compromise of these processes, role players, data set, metrics, and tools. Both, of course, can include EVA. Both will require compliance and assurance. The note would be that we should recognize that we have not discussed the details of pure program management or portfolio management. Both of those are covered in much more detail if you were to look at the Axelos P3M framework. In here, we're talking of the basic setup and operation and control and reporting of a project and a program in order to allow program management or portfolio management to exist. So myth number 2, hopefully you can see, is busted. Number 3, an effective EVMS by definition needs to be 100% compliant with the industry standard. Well, if your contract says that you are EIA 748 obligated, then yes, you're pretty much nailed to that compliance. However, in normal circumstances, that isn't true. Your contract will state whether or not if you have to step up to the plate to that level. It will specifically mention that in the contract narrative, in which case all 32 rules to their nth degree will need to be applied. Be careful what you wish for, again, is my takeaway. If an EVMS is continually obligated or If internal management decide on its implementation and use, then tailoring should be considered. I can't emphasize that strongly enough. In which case, in reality, you will be looking more at a project control system with earned value management analysis being applied. One last note on this one here is that it's important to recognize that EVMS in its most rigorous state of implementation has to be best aimed at new product introduction. This is where all your major risks are going to be in development. This is where your large costs will be initially incurred. This is where your specialist resources will be used and will be stretched. So an earned value management system will add a lot of control and reporting to that type of program. As you begin to move into production and in service, then you can maybe step away, tailor those explicit rules if you are obligated to EIA 748, or of course you can move into a project control system which will offer you similar or same type benefits. Scott, to you.
Thank you, Martin. Excellent. So when Martin and I did a rehearsal yesterday, we were worried that we would take too much time. We're absolutely bang on track at the moment, so that's a minor miracle in its own way. Cracking along, Martin, an SPI of about 1 at the moment, or schedule variance of 0, should I say?
Yeah, that makes a nice change.
So, in Martin's truths, he mentioned truth number 2, the importance of the baseline. And this really is critical in an earned value management system. So we're going to spend a little bit more time now looking at the performance measurement baseline, a fundamental foundation of effective earned value management. So what I'm bringing up here for you, if you see this slide, is the APM definition of a baseline. What I want to do is expand on a few points here. So taking up the first highlighted point here, it is the baseline against which project performance is measured. That seems obvious. However, we often live in a world of hierarchical baselines, driving plans, recovery schedules, all sorts of other stuff flying around our complex projects. But be under no illusion. A project's primary point of reference should always be its performance measurement baseline, i.e. the baseline against which you measure performance. The clue is in the title. Yes, you will obviously use other metrics, and you'll, if you are in a recovery situation, you may wish to measure yourself against recovery, but the project is measuring itself against the baseline. That's its status. An important point here is the baseline forms up of the work you are doing, no more, no less. So that's your contract, as it were, with the approving authority of your baseline, saying this is all I'm going to do, no more, no less. The second point I've highlighted here is the baseline must encompass the entire scope of the project. And that entire scope would also include thinking about schedule and cost. And once again, this seems obvious, does it not? However, I'm sure we've all worked in projects where there's bits of scope missing. We're getting repeated change, and we're not too sure whether actually the scope we're delivering today is the formal scope, because that change has been approved, or not. And it must be very difficult, but it is very difficult, providing confidence to your customer of your project that you've absolutely got this under control when you don't fully understand your scope. And I just want to emphasize again before I move on a slide here about the schedule and cost element. A baseline is the coherent view of my scope, what am I trying to do, my schedule, when am I trying to do it, who's doing it, etc., and my cost. Those three things work together to form a whole. Often you'll see a risk halo around that as well, describing what risks I've got outside of my baseline currently, and what may come into my baseline via change, but more on that later. So let's move on. The performance measurement baseline. I'm going to walk you through a few steps here of how you might perform, or how might you get to an effective PMB. So let's start with aligning to requirements. And the first point I want to reference here is about structures. The first structure I'm interested in is what am I here to deliver? Often called your product breakdown structures, my PBS. Then I'm worried about how am I going to deliver it, my work breakdown structure. And then I can think about who's going to deliver it, my organizational breakdown structure. And those all must be aligned to what I'm trying to achieve in my project. Having established my requirements, having got my structures in place, I can then start to estimate. Now, I will talk a little bit later about basis of estimate, and only very briefly, but you've got to start somewhere. How do you start estimating my project? And that's where you start, basically. And estimating isn't often, I mean, I see often we fall into the trap of just estimating cost. Estimation is time, resource, perhaps my procurement costs, overheads. It is everything that I need to estimate to make sure that I end up with a valid and credible baseline. Having started my estimating, what I need to do is time phase that, because in the end of the day, a performance-based PMB, a performance measurement baseline, is a time phase cost of delivery of my baseline, of my work. So I need to time phase it. So it's not just the what, it's the when. When will I be spending that money? And another important factor, when will I need that resource? Because it could be I'm after a specialist resource in my project. And that's a nice segue onto the next particular thing there, resourcing. This isn't just about cost. You know, I need to understand what resource I have. Does it exist when I need it? Does it even exist in the company at all? Do I need to buy it in? Will it cost more? All of those factors. Having then developed a resourced, time-phased, estimated baseline that is aligned to my requirements, I need to substantiate it. So I need to really understand my basis of estimate. And it's important to remember at this particular phase, a basis of estimate will never be perfect, but it does need to be credible. I'll give you an example which we often see is we try to make projects very aggressive. And if a project baseline is too aggressive to start with, you will often lose the plot early and you'll never recover. And Martin, I've got a couple of little sort of metrics for you at the end on the very final slide that are truisms. They've never been broken, these truths, in terms of own value management projects, about how recovery is just basically almost impossible. So in my personal view, and I've seen this a lot, is aggressive baselines are a false economy. It's often better to start with a more credible baseline and you're likely to deliver more on time and more on budget than you would have done if you tried to go too aggressive to start with. Often you spend a lot of money trying to recover and you don't recover. You actually gets worse because you lose the plot on the baseline. So having substantiated my baseline with a basis of estimate, etc., I then agree it and I snap that baseline. And this is really important because as a project manager, it is this PMB that I'm going to be held to account against after all. So I want to make sure I agree it with the right people, and I want to make sure that, moving on to the penultimate bullet point there, that is under configuration control. No one should be able to change that baseline without my authority as the project manager. And I just want to make a point here, and you probably heard this before, about good and bad change. As a project manager, good change could be, for example, the controlled injection of new scope, or moving money from my management reserve into my baseline so I can actually do some additional activity to manage a risk. Bad change is when my project is not going well, so I'm running late or over budget, and I try and rebaseline without necessarily understanding why my project has gone late and over budget, which probably means after I've rebaselined, it will go late and over budget again. So once again, as a project manager, I'm looking for change control here of good change, i.e. say injection of scope or something. The last bullet point on this one is, once I've got my baseline struck, I start my project. What I do then is start to forecast ahead. And this is once again looking at those forward metrics. So I can actually look ahead now and say, when do I think I'll outturn that? When do I think this particular package of work will outturn based around my own value metrics? And therefore, does that affect a dependency on another piece of work? So it gives me the power to really start to look ahead and forecast forwards. So that's the basic principles of striking a baseline for an own value management system. Moving on. So this slide, hopefully many of you already seen, and I'm just going to pull out a few points of this slide. I'm not going to go into the real detail of this slide. And I'm going to start here with the dotted line. So you can see there's a dotted line across the middle of the screen. Everything above that dotted line is owned by the business, so to speak. Below the dotted line, it's owned by the project and the project manager. That's their scope of responsibility. It doesn't mean that that dotted line is not necessarily, absolutely nothing shall cross it. For example, it could be that if I'm running a project and I've exhausted my management reserve and I still need more money, I may need to raise a change to dip into, let's say, the profit. Now, If I start dipping into the profit, of course, that generally means a meeting without coffee with my boss, and it's a bad thing. So there is a level of change there that we need to think about. So as a project, I want to consider myself below the dotted line, and I don't want to have to worry about above the dotted line. And conversely, if I deliver my project and don't eat all my management reserve in managing my risks throughout the project, and I'm on, let's say, a firm price contract, that management reserve could go to profit, which once again is owned by the business, but it's a good thing. The other point I wanted to point out on this slide is the relationship between the IMS and the PMB. Now, this has got an interesting point because in the UK, we often don't differentiate between these two things. Often organizations talk about the PMB as being the overall collection of artifacts that form my baseline. And that is fine. When Martin and I talk about EIA 748, the PMB is something quite specific. The PMB I mentioned before is a time-phased cost of delivery of the project. That, of course, is completely educated and informed by the integrated master schedule. So the IMS and the PMB are, in the words I use, complementary and contemporary. They work together and are aligned, and they must always work together and they must always be aligned. And it's also worth me pointing out, when I talk about integrated master schedule here, I often hear people talk about an IMS as being integrated because we're integrating this contractor, that contractor, this baseline over here, and this baseline over here. That's a valid statement, but integrated in my language means horizontal integration, which means I'm talking about relationships, dependencies, handoffs, etc., i.e. the schedule logic, and vertical integration, which is the consistency between the various schedules of the WBS. Right, so I think that's key for that slide. So I'm going to move on to the next slide now. So we're going to move on then to myth number 4. Martin's described a lot about this as well. And this is a simple one. I often see it in my world that say, I've got a discrete schedule, therefore I'm doing EV. And Martin described this before. That's not necessarily the case. I can do earned value analysis on that, and I may have the world's best schedule. I may have some fantastically good data coming through, but I'm not necessarily doing earned value management, because earned value management involves those 32 criteria. What I may be doing is some really, really good earned value style analysis on that schedule. So I just want to take it there that while strictly speaking, I can do earned value analysis, I'm not doing earned value management. And this is the point of the 3 webinars that Martin and I want, that when people are assuming you're doing earned value management, i.e. there's a rigorous system below it, what are people assuming? So when your boss says, are you doing earned value management? You go, yes. Is that person expecting EIA 748 and the full 32 criteria? Or are they expecting a really solid project control system underneath, underpinning some earned value analysis? There is a difference. So that myth per se is busted because, as I say, the two aren't necessarily the same thing. Right, I'm going to move on to a final myth now. And what I will say about this particular myth is I don't think we've actually busted this one. But what I will say is this is just a truth, and I need to say this. Done well and done appropriately, earned value management is a proven way of delivering projects on time and on budget. Done badly and inappropriately applied, it probably won't help and could be a very, very costly way to fail. And that goes back to Martin's points before about, do you want to have a contractually binding earned value management system, or do you just want to do really good project controls and a good analysis? So I'm going to claim that's busted because it's true. It's just one of those facts of life. But what we'll talk to you more about, though, in webinar 2 is what goes to make up a good earned value management system, how you can tailor it. So you can start to learn about what might be appropriate for your project and how you may wish to deploy more of the features in an earned value management system in your project than you do today to get added value out, to get that credibility of data, so you can really do the analysis and make good management decisions based around that. So we're now about 2 minutes ahead of schedule. So once again, that's not bad. A schedule variance of -2 or 3 minutes there, Martin. So good. So we now have questions. And what I'll do is, Martin's on the other end as well. I'll read some questions out and we'll try and answer as many as possible in the 15 minutes. Oh, now this is an interesting one. So Martin, get ready for this one. We may have to think about this a bit. Question:
Okay.
How do you handle EVM scope with agile projects? As I understand it, agile projects tend to have fluid deliverables. Yeah. So agile projects, the tradable is effectively your scope, not your time and cost, as it were. I'll confess, I don't necessarily know the answer to that, but I'm aware there is work going on to look at the shall we say, docking of agile and EV. Martin, do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I think I can answer that one. Whether you're operating in an agile world or not, the old adage of the baseline being the baseline is still true. Typically, in an IT world where agile is perhaps more prominent than anywhere else, they will set out doing sprints along a timeline that will get them to an intended stated goal. There will have to be a firm timeline to meet that goal. There will have to be a targeted budget that they can operate in. And therefore your performance management baseline, your schedule will still show those pictures as you move forward. The only thing with agile is that you're probably more likely to incur additional baseline changes as you do a big rolling wave as the sprints become more and more into play. But whilst there are some idiosyncrasies, largely the same rules. There is a flow of requirements. There is a stated timeline. There is a perceived allowable budget with a number of resources to operate within. Still applies. Those processes that I've alluded to previously, and the metrics that Scott has spoken about also, they still very much come into play. It really comes down to the baseline being managed in an agile environment. But now, all things being equal, you will be operating a project control system with agile being incorporated.
Thanks, Martin. I have seen an APM paper on this, so it's probably worth looking at the resource base on the APM's website and see if you can find it. I don't know if it's been published yet, but it is definitely a piece of sort of work that people are looking at and how they can dock these two different systems together. Thank you for that. So the next question: does the management reserve always sit below the dotted line? I've often seen it owned by the business with a request of the business to use it if risks materialize. So the answer to that is, in an own value management system, yes, in theory it should, because the project manager needs the agility to move quite quick on risk. I've also seen it where the MR has been split in two, so some of it sits above the line, some of it sits below. And you know, the 32 criteria will insist that the project manager has access to a management reserve that he or she can use quickly to manage risk. Martin, have you seen it 100% above the dotted line before?
It's a very good question. With EIA 748, that there is no room for argument. All of the management reserve will be held below the line and will form part of the total allocated budget. It will be owned by the project. The way that comes about in the first instance is the fact that it is a view of all unmitigated risks and the appetite for risk. So if you were to have 10 risks, each of £100,000 each, potentially £1 million of additional management reserve would be required. You then got the option through negotiation discussion, if you like, to say, right, I need £1 million as management reserve. Why? Because I've got 10 risks of £100,000. They may happen. Equally, you may say, okay, pragmatically, only 75% of those risks are likely to come in. Therefore, I'll reduce that million down to 750. Equally, you might say, well, we feel pretty nervous about this project. It's very innovative. That £1 million is quite likely. And there may be some more, in which case you might say, I need 1.25 million, 1.5 million. In each case, that management reserve in an EIA 748 world is owned and is part of the baseline and is utilized through baseline change control as the project unfolds. Now, at the end of a project, that management reserve could quite rightly go back above the line and be held within the business for other projects or programs. Typically, when you're operating in the US Department of Defense world, then there may be some contract negotiations where some of that unused management reserve may be offered to the contractor as form of profit. If you operate outside of EIA 748 and you've got a little bit more leeway, then yes, management reserve can be held above the line and it can be distributed by the business. It becomes very bureaucratic if you do that. It becomes long-winded because there's a whole new chain of people involved in decisions and documentation. So it's not necessarily the best way of operating, but yes, it can operate that way if you so do wish.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. It's same conclusion. EV, you know, a pure EVM system required to below the dotted line. But if a business needs to operate in a certain way because for various reasons, then there's always ability to, you know, tailor the system to work most effectively for yourself. So moving on to a couple more questions. I just one here saying, you said your intro, schedule variance, almost unheard of, lol. Very good. Yeah, I mean, exactly, that's the point we're making. We get obsessed with SPI and CPI, yet schedule variance, which is just another important metric, almost unheard of. So Maggie asked, she's not familiar with the 32 rules of EVMS. Please, can we describe some of them? Maggie, you'll be pleased to know that in webinar 2, that's exactly what we'll be doing. And I've just put up the dates on the screen, so hopefully you can see those. And we've got two related questions here about the value of doing EVA. So when does it become beneficial? And this is an incredibly difficult question to answer because it's not just about the value of a project. Martin's already pointed out before that EV lends itself to certain types of project and not to others. So, for example, EV is really good at design development projects where you've got milestones, and you've got discrete packages of work you can actually measure. It's not brilliant when you're just on a production line, for example, which strictly speaking is not a project, of course. Then, of course, you get complexity, you get value. But one of the questions here is, would it be of value on a 20K project? If you haven't done earned value management before, setting up an earned value management system is a costly thing. And in webinar 3, we'll get into one of the reasons why it's costly, because it needs to be assured. And that starts to add real money, quite frankly, into setting up a brand new system. Because a company, generally speaking, companies will want to operate all their projects in roughly the same way. So a company will want to actually reorganize itself so it can operate EV as appropriate on contracts. Having said that, though, if you have a company that's really familiar with EV and it does it naturally anyway, you can drive that value of your project down to a much lower value. I would still suggest 20K is a tiny project to be using EV on. Martin, once again, I just defer to yourself a little bit more there. In terms of, I don't think there's a golden rule saying any project over 5 million use EV, below 5 million don't bother. I think it's more to do with complexity, the experience a company's got with EV, and a number of other factors, whether you'd want to deploy it on a small or large project.
Absolutely, I would agree. To roll out earned value on a £20,000 project is really not worthwhile. A project control system that you will have using standard metric, standard data sets will give you just as good information without the additional costs involved.
Yeah, and it's also worth pointing out that running an EV project does require, generally speaking, more resource actually during the project. So it's not just about setting up. There is, you know, your project management office running an EV-based project is probably going to have more people in it doing the analysis, really, you know, being quite forensic with the data. So that's actually, we've got 3 questions on that. So thank you for that. Right, Martin, this is definitely one for you, and I'm gonna be a little bit of a coward here and call this out. I've got a question from James. We use an ERP system called IFS. Have you experienced this, and can EVM be applied to this system? I've not seen IFS before.
No, I may know it by a different name, but IFS is not familiar to me.
Okay, thank you. No, not me either. Apologies for that, James.
Generally, an ERP system, just one comment on that. Generally, an ERP system is a fundamental of a business. It is the enterprise resource management process. So it's the setting of your resources in terms of numbers and skills, both man and machine. It's not all about human resources, obviously. You know, you've got facilities, etc., etc. And in allocating those resources to projects and programs adequately and in time, that is a fundamental of EIA 748. If you are contracted to 748, then it will be expected that your company will have an adequate ERP system to furnish your earned value management system. And indeed, you'd have to argue that you would really need that even if you were to set up and deploy a project control system as well. But IFS, I'm not familiar with as a term.
No, no worries. Apologies for that. Ian has also, he's obviously used IFS. He said, yes, IFS will support EVM in projects functional area.
Yeah, I would think it would do, being it's part of ERM.
Awesome. I've got a question here from Zoran. What happens where a project manager isn't necessarily responsible for the budget, i.e. in construction, where a QS/cost manager is involved? So I think the answer to that in my world is fairly simple. The project manager must be responsible for the budget because they are managing the combination of scope, cost, and time. The QS and cost manager is supporting them in that role, but overall authority for management of that budget is the project managers in an EV world. Otherwise, they can't do the trade-offs and manage that baseline. I'm not familiar with a system where someone else will be responsible for the actual budget as opposed to just supporting the project manager be responsible for it.
It does happen. There are some environments where there is a split of ownership, if you like. But what I will say is that it adds confusion, it adds complication, and if you do go down that path, then you have to ensure that both parties that own the cost, that own the schedule, or indeed own the resources, if you split it even further, they are on the same page, and that they do recognize the baseline and that they do recognize change control. Hence, when you do make changes or even reach the original agreements, it takes so much longer and there's a lot more confusion. So be careful if that's your environment. There are better ways of operating.
Good, excellent, thank you, Martin. And we'll do one more question. And this one's hopefully fairly easy. Martin, I will be strongly agreeing on this. Do you baseline the plan with management reserve or move before baselining the plan? So if I go back to the sort of stacking diagram you saw earlier, the PMB contains the work I'm going to do. So it's the baseline against, it's basically a statement of what I'm going to do, nothing more, nothing less. So in that baseline, if I've got an identified risk mitigation action, that gets incorporated into my PMB. What's remaining, as it were, between that and my contract budgeted baseline sits in the management reserve. But the two things together form what sits below the dotted line. So they are baselined together. They're just in two separate buckets, as it were. Noting, of course, I just want to emphasize the fact that the PMB is all about the work I say I'm going to do. So if I'm not going to do it, it shouldn't be in the PMB. So if there's a risk, for example, I've identified, and I'm not too sure whether I'm going to mitigate it or not, that money for that should in theory sit in the management reserve until I decide I'm going to do it, and then I bring it into the PMB via change control. Right, that is all the time we've got for questions. So according to my watch, which often runs a bit fast, it's now 13:29. Many thanks to everyone who attended today. Hopefully on your screen you can see that we've got 2 more webinars to go on the Tuesday the 3rd at 12:30 also, and Tuesday the 24th. So please come back for some more.
Thank you both very much for your time today, Scott and Martin. It was a really engaging hour.
Pleasure.
And we look forward to the next 2 webinars in this series. And thank you also to the audience for attending. I hope you're keeping safe and well.
Thank you all.